We've gotten down to Isaiah chapter 19, and we were about to start verse 17. But in verses 16 through verse 22 of this chapter, we have what I titled Conversion of Some Egyptians to Jehovah. And in verse 16, in that day Egypt shall be likened to women, and it shall be afraid and fear, because the shaking of the hand of the Lord of hosts, which he shaketh over it, the fear that's coming upon Egypt. And verse 17, that the land of Judah shall be a terror unto Egypt. Every one that maketh mention thereof shall be afraid in himself, because of the counsel of the Lord of hosts, which he hath determined against it. Judah, of course, is the southern kingdom, and it's also going to become a terror to Egypt. That probably did not take place that many times throughout the history of Israel and Egypt. But now then, the very mention of Judah by the Egyptians would cause fear in them, because they expected to hear of an invasion that would be coming. If you don't, I imagine that everyone should remember the layout of the land and what you would have, for example, people from Medo-Persians, the Babylonians, even to a certain extent the Assyrians. They would all follow you have the Fertile Crest in there, which would be where Babylon would be. And they would come up kind of a northwestern path, and then come down south through the land of Israel. The reason being that between, for example, Babylon and the southern part of, or the majority of Israel, was a desert. So they wouldn't pass through that. They would go through this kind of a semicircle and then come straight southward. So one of these nations coming to invade Egypt would follow that path, and so if they heard something from Judah, they can suspect here comes an invasion, because someone's coming south, and now they're going to be coming on toward Egypt. But God had determined that he was going to destroy Egypt, or bring a destruction upon them. During Hezekiah's reign, Judah became a subordinate to Assyria. And so they were basically helping the Assyrians. And so when the Assyrians would come through, they would go on down into Egypt. And so if they heard, something from Judah, well, here comes the Assyrians as well. The pulpit commentary notes that in Manasseh's reign, Judah became subject to Assyria, 2 Chronicles 33 and verse 11, and had to take part in the hostile expeditions, which both Esarhaddon and his son Ashurbanipal conducted against Egypt. Egypt had to keep her eye on Judah continually to see when danger was approaching her. And they conclude by saying, it is not likely that Isaiah's prophecies caused the terror here spoken of. That's what they say, but why wouldn't it? If they know that Assyria is coming to battle against them, why wouldn't it cause terror on their part? Later on in Judah's history, you remember Josiah, King Josiah? He was a good king, brought about a restoration of the temple and worship to Jehovah. We find him going to battle against Pharaoh Necho of Egypt, or Nekon of Egypt. And he possibly as an ally of Assyria as well. So you have all of those things leading to Judah being a terror unto Egypt. So in verse 18, in that day, 5 cities in the land of Egypt speak the land of Canaan, and swear to the Lord of hosts, they shall be called the city of destruction. Isaiah in this notes that some, or there would be some in Egypt that would speak the Israelite language, and they would be swearing to Jehovah or Yahweh. In other words, they're going to embrace the Jewish religion. I wanted to kind of pause at this point, though. These 5 cities shall speak the language of Canaan. Do you remember after the period of captivity, the Israelites are allowed to return to the land, and later allowed to rebuild the temple and then rebuild the walls of the city. But when they return, do you remember a comment that's made? It's found in Nehemiah chapter 13 and verse 24. That's a paraphrase of it. Their children spake half in the speech of Ashdod, and could not speak in the Jews' language, but according to the language of each people. Nehemiah chapter 13 and verse 24. There is a principle of speaking in the Jews' language that I want to mention, except making a application to the church today. This was a historical event that they could not speak the Hebrew language. They spoke another language, really, because they had been 70 years in captivity. And so those children grew up in that type of a land, speaking that language, and now then that they've returned, they can't speak the Jews' language. What does Peter state in 1 Peter 4 and verse 11? Okay, if any man speak, let him speak as the oracles of God. There's a lot of lessons that we could speak about. One is that the language of the world. How many times has the language of the world made its influence upon members of the Lord's church? A lot of times. It is amazing that some of the language we hear coming from those who are supposedly members of the Lord's church. I'll just tell you this one from Facebook that happened within the past week. Somebody had posted something, and the response was, starting out, the first phrase is, "What the hell?" That was the way in which he started it. That person's no longer in that group because I'm an administrator, and I immediately started challenging him on it, and he defended it. Defended it, yes. Nothing wrong with it. As far as I know. As I say, he didn't stay in that group long because I banned him. And would again. How many times do we hear members of the church use either OMG or oh my, or say the words "oh my God"? We've allowed the world to influence us. That's true. A lot of times people don't think about what they say. You're right. The problem is, why don't they? Why haven't they?
The word you just mentioned, hell, is the most misused in the world.
It is.
It could be hot as that, cold as that, dry as that, red as that, high as that, deep as that, and they use it all for it.
It becomes a byword that applies to anything and everything, and so they use that word. You're right. There is a proper use of the word hell. Not that it is wrong to use it in that proper context, but when you use it as a byword, then there's something wrong with it, just like any term would be. How many times do we hear the euphemisms of gosh, gee whiz, golly, gee, and on you can go with the euphemisms that are nothing more than taking the Lord's name in vain.
When I was in basic army, he told us we're showing our ignorance. You don't have a vocabulary.
You don't have a vocabulary, and you're showing your ignorance. And yeah, that has been stated many times through the years, that cursing in that way is the language of ignorance. But it's an application of what we see here in regards to they're speaking the language not of God, but of the world in this case. And anytime I preach about euphemisms and I start mentioning some, most of the time someone will come up and say it and argue with me about a certain word. That's not what it means. I tell them, go look it up. Get a dictionary and look it up. And invariably they find out, yeah, it is. Have they thought about it? Why haven't they? Why haven't they heard sermons about it? That's about as bad. Or lessons about it. But that is one way in which the world has influenced the language of Christians. Calvinism and denominational thinking and language has influenced members of the church without their knowledge. Have you ever heard about someone who died or did not die, either whichever way it place. Well, it was just his time, or it wasn't his time. Ever heard that by members of the church? That is false. It's error. It's a concept of Calvinism that says your life is predetermined, and not only is your life, but your death is. It has been predetermined by God when you're going to die. That's false. But yet we hear it all the time. By members of the church I'm talking about now. Other phrases. Well, that just wasn't to be. Well, that again is a predetermination of Calvinism.
They use que sera,
Yeah, que sera, sera, which translated is whatever will be, will be.
There was a song about that, by the way, back.
I remember I like the song actually. I don't know about y'all, but I like the song. But it is a song that teaches that denominational concept.
God prearranged your life. Why is he not responsible for the evil you commit? He prearranged it.
Well, that's the logical conclusion, Dale, but that's really beside the point as to what we're discussing is that we have allowed that language to come into our vocabulary, and a lot of times without ever thinking. We don't think about what we say. Now then, is Christian to do that? No. Needs to be thinking about what he says. But we've picked up the language of the denominations and brought it over with us from them. And so we're speaking the language of the denominational world instead of the language of God. We need to be careful about what we say and make sure that the concepts that we talk about at all time are truthful. Another that we hear, rest in peace, are using the RIP for it. And the person that's used of might have been a reprobate, heathen, not even believer in God. Well, he's at peace now. Or sometimes if they were suffering here in this life, well, he's in a better place. Or he's at peace now. And when I hear members of the church do that, I want to take them and beat them half to death. And no, I'm kidding about that. It does kind of infuriate me, though. Why? I think in that case, a lot of the reason is they don't know what to say, and so they have to say something they feel like, and so, they're trying to give comfort to the family or to others.
What they're meaning is he's not suffering here.
Yeah, he's not suffering here now, but in reality, he's suffering a whole lot worse than anything that he suffered here in this world, and that's the problem with it. And if they were resting in peace, and yet they lived as heathen, they weren't Christians, then why should any of their family become Christians? Why should they live a Christian life? I mean, that individual didn't, and you're already saying he's resting in peace.
Well, I hope when I die they can truly say that about me. He's in a better place.
Well, that should be the desire of each and every one of us, that they could actually say, and it be truthful, rest in peace, or he is in a better place. If we live the Christian life, that's certainly the case. But why would members of the church use that type of an idea and concept about someone who is not a Christian, and not a faithful Christian at that? it's because we picked up the language of the world. And the denominational world that basically says, it doesn't really matter what you do, you're going to heaven anyway. If you go to some denominational funerals, they've never lost a case. Every one of them's in heaven, no matter how they lived or what they did. They preach them into heaven. Based on our knowledge, now then understand that statement, based on our knowledge, we can determine whether someone is in heaven or not. Now then, our knowledge is not a complete knowledge. That's why I say based on our knowledge. There might be something that we don't know about in regards to that individual that might change that. But to our knowledge, we can say, since Paul used the illustration, I hope that when Paul dies, he's in heaven or in paradise. Why? Because the life that he lives is in harmony with God's Word. Now then, that's to our knowledge, of course. But when we know someone's not living a Christian life and we give hope like that, why? Now, you don't want to be mean or rude or anything like that, but there's no reason to give them hope that he's resting in peace or that he's in a better place because he's not or she's not. So we need to learn the language of God. That's the point. So that when we speak, we're speaking the oracles of God. Not the oracles of the world, not the oracles of denominations, but the oracles of God, or the words of God. And that takes study and reading God's Word on a regular basis. And being careful as far as those other influences and allowing them to influence us in the wrong way. So that's a little excursion. Y'all get that part for free. But here's some in Egypt that's going to speak the Israelite language. They're going to be swearing allegiance to Yahweh of hosts. What's the idea of host? Armies, that's it. It's armies. That's what he's talking about. The Lord of armies. I won't comment. Lord of armies. When we think of the Lord, do we think of him that way very often? Go back and see how many times the Bible refers to him in that way, especially the Old Testament. I'm sure that it does. I'm sure that it does in just about all of the books, especially the prophetic books. When it gets to, in that day shall 5 cities in the land, there is a discussion as to whether or not those 5 cities are literal 5 cities or if it's a symbolic number. Some individuals state that the cities are literal and that they are Leontopolis, Hierapolis, Migdol, Daphne, and Memphis. Those would be the 5 cities. Those were 5 of the main cities of Egypt. And then the city of destruction, which city is that? Well, some say that it's the city of Memphis. You been to Memphis? I won't even mention Memphis, Tennessee. I'll be nice. This would be Memphis in Egypt. Others say that it's Hierapolis. There's also a discrepancy as to whether the word is destruction, the city of destruction, or if it's the city of the sun. Textual discrepancy now is what you're dealing with. Or it might be city of defense, or it might be city of deliverance. So any of those, though, you could go through, and to a certain extent that's going to be dealing with that city as to how it's taken. Whether it's literal in those 5 cities, whether it's figuratively speaking, it's still showing that there's people in the land of Egypt, whether it be those 5 cities specifically or a symbolic of being all of Egypt. Not every individual, of course, not every saved, but individuals within Egypt and throughout the land are going to be swearing to the Lord of hosts. They're going to be swearing their allegiance to Yahweh. And certainly it would be a city of, if you take that as deliverance, it would be a city of deliverance in that situation, because that would deliver them. So verse 19, in that day there shall be an altar to the Lord in the midst of the land of Egypt, and a pillar at the border thereof to the Lord. Isaiah shows here the importance of the worship of Yahweh, the Lord, in Egypt. I think it's interesting as you read this and then you look at Israel itself. When you look at Israel's history, what are they continually doing? Well, yes, they are sinning. That's not really the idea that I was wanting to express, but yes, they are sinning. That's
They're being inconsistent. Faithful and then leaving.
Bill.
They're repenting and the Lord delivers them. Then they go back sinning. Somebody comes in, oppresses them, and they ask for deliverance.
Okay.
The Lord delivers them over and over.
Okay, that's period of Judges in particular, but what I was getting at is that they continually are leaving the worship of Jehovah. And here's the Egyptians, what are they doing now? They're coming to it. And if you look at the history of Egypt, what do you have? All of these idols and false gods, and they're leaving those and going to worship the one God of Yahweh. And here's the Israelites who are given all of these blessings and all of the provisions that God has given unto them. And what do? They're continually leaving Him. Can we say that man is rather fickle in his nature? lot of times we don't know how good we have it, do we? Until we lose it. That was Israel. And yes, that goes on throughout their history. They did not really know how good they had it until they lost it. Well,
You're trying to say that's probably Christ, that altar was given, referred to Christ.
we'll get to that in the next few verses. But yes, probably so. It's dealing with the Messiah. The altar here is not a temple, or not the temple. And a pillar would be a memorial stone or a obelisk. And they are going to build those things to God. It would be built, he expresses it, at the border thereof. That would be the border between Israel and Egypt. Now, why would they do that? To indicate that they had a common faith. We're one with you. Well, how? Well, here, right at the border, we're going to build this altar and put a pillar there, and thus indicate the commonality between us. Wayne Jackson noted that though the passage may merely assert a worship of the true God, it is nonetheless a fact that a temple was built at Leontopolis by a Jewish priest, Onias IV, around 160 BC. Josephus records that permission for the project was granted due to the influence of this very passage, which was shown to Ptolemy VI Philometor. Now then, to me that becomes amazing. Not only does Isaiah prophesy it, but what is this? Almost 540 years later, or thereabouts, they take it and show what Isaiah says to the Pharaoh, Ptolemy VI, which is Philometor, and because he sees it, they're able to build it. You basically have the same thing taking place in relationship to what Daniel what Isaiah prophesies in relationship to Cyrus the Great. Isaiah prophesies about the Medo-Persian Empire and names Cyrus the Great as being God's messenger. And historically, they show Cyrus that which Isaiah has prophesied, and because of that, Cyrus the Great says, okay, all you Israelites can go back to Jerusalem. They want to. Amazing prophecies in the Bible that just, in certain ways, are brought about by them seeing what they are going to do. And so they go ahead and do it. Dale?
And Josiah's name in 1 Kings 13, somewhere around there.
Now what?
Josiah.
Oh, Josiah? Okay.
1 Kings 13.
This would be a long time after Josiah, though.
Yeah, it would.
So I'm not sure exactly what you're referencing with Josiah.
This has happened a bunch of times. Point. The Bible is a unique book. That's what.
You're talking about prophecies?
You know,
Okay.
3 times at least that instant happened.
Okay. But here, the Egyptians now worshiping God, having this common faith one with the other. Verse 20 then.
How long is this from the time that they left Israel with Moses? About 400 years?
They left Egypt about 1500 BC. This, when Isaiah writes, is about 700 BC. So what is that? About 800 years.
So did that Egyptian Ptolemy, did he believe in God? The Pharaoh?
I can't say for certain whether Ptolemy Philometor actually believed in God, but he did allow those things to be built because of what he has seen. And Philometor would have been in around 160 BC. So what does that make it? What is that, 1,340 years from the time of Moses? It's my addition, right? So that's about what you have. And 700 BC at the time of thereabouts of Isaiah's writing. So even from there to Ptolemy, you have quite a few years. Someone else made a comment, and okay, maybe not. Verse 20 then. And it shall be for a sign and for a witness unto the Lord of hosts and the land of Egypt, for they shall cry unto the Lord because of the oppressors, and he shall send them a Savior, and a great one, and he shall deliver them. So the altar and the pillar serve as a sign to their contemporaries, and a witness to their descendants of a coming Savior that would deliver them. Now, yes, I do believe that this is a reference to the Messiah and a belief in him. They're not going to cry to their idols. Now, the Egyptians, they had all kinds of idols to just about everything. They're no longer going to cry to them for their help and for their deliverance, but now then they're going to cry to Yahweh, to Jehovah, who would deliver them. There are some who believe that this has reference to a physical deliverance from an oppressor. Some have suggested that oppressor being Alexander the Great. As I said, I think it has reference to the Messiah, the Christ. And I think the entire tenor of the passage is it shows it to be a messianic promise or prophecy. Not of one who would deliver from physical oppression, but from spiritual oppression, from sin and from Satan. And thus the oppressor there not being a physical nation that was oppressing Egypt, but from a spiritual standpoint of being oppressed by sin and by Satan. And thus they would do sacrifice and oblation to God. We'll see in verse 21. But they're going to cry unto Yahweh. I think, and we'll kind of end with this point, so won't be able to develop it greatly, but I think a lot of the reason that we have difficulty today in evangelism, and this is my opinion, so you can take it for what it's worth, and with $5 or so, you can go get you a cup of coffee. But we can't get people to cry unto to God for deliverance. Why do they need deliverance from anything? They've got everything that they need, so they think, of course. And they're thinking from a physical standpoint. Got everything that they need. They got all the comforts in the world. Why do I need God? Here you see, they shall cry unto the Lord. Why? Why are they crying to Him? Because they need help. Look at people in the world today. Do they need help? They don't think so. So there's no reason to cry to God. They don't need Him. And that makes evangelism to those individuals a fruitless situation. I'm not saying, I started to say worthless. It's not worthless. It's we're doing what God says, whether they accept it or not. But it's going to be fruitless from the standpoint of them in being converted to Christ because they don't see any need for it.
So one of our door knocking campaigns was trying to, they wanted to set up a Bible study. They called back a firmer date. She said, oh, I've got everything that meets my needs at this point. So, need that.
Yeah, I've got everything that meets my needs at this point in time. I don't need it. And that is exactly what you see. And as a result, why should I obey the gospel? Why should I live the Christian life? And you see people who, I believe in God, and yet how many of them will darken the doors of any religious group's doors? But I believe in God. Are you going to heaven? Well, sure I am. Well, that's what they think, of course. And so why should they obey the gospel? Why should they do what they need to do as far as what the Bible teaches? And so we have difficulties with that. Okay, we'll begin with verse 21 then, Lord willing, next time.